Now it is. When you think of the great cultures of the ancient world, great foundation cultures, who do we think of?
Greece.
Great Greece and Rome. Good thing you guys got the right answers. I got no other images. But Greece and Rome gave us the lion's share of our worldview, primarily in the West, but it influenced the whole world. Greece with the idea of philosophy, art, beauty, empirical science. And the Roman Empire with the ideas of government, law, engineering, modern armies. And obviously many other civilizations contributed. And even if we don't have the time to look at all of them, we don't have to. Because one of the things I discovered when creating the presentation, is that culture varies just like it does today from place to place. But values in the ancient world with slight variations are pretty much the same thing everywhere. So with that introduction in mind, let's get in our time capsule, travel back to the ancient world, beginning with value of life. Let's see what did they think of these values. Our goal is to see where do we get the values from. Everyone following? Yep? Okay. So a couple of examples to illustrate how different is the idea of value of life in the ancient world. Anyone know the most common form of population control practiced by like every single civilization we know of in antiquity? How do they control populations? They killed babies. Infanticide, universal practice in the ancient world. Not just as a means of population control, but also as a means of sex selection. Sorry, ladies, but in most ancient cultures, boys were considered valuable and girls were considered disposable. In a place like ancient Greece, right after birth, unwanted newborn baby would be taken by the parents, chucked into a clay jar and thrown out in the garbage, or dropped down a well to drown, or left out in a rock in the woods to be eaten by a wild animal or die of exposure. And this was considered to be totally normal and acceptable. Here's a Roman writing to his wife 2,000 years ago. He says, "Know that I am still in Alexandria, and I ask and beg of you to take good care of our baby son. And as soon as I receive payment, I will send it up to you. If you deliver of a child, if it is a boy, keep it. If it is a girl, discard it." Now, we don't get shocked too easily today, but you hear about killing or injuring of a child or a baby? Oh my God. In the ancient world, completely normal and acceptable. Another shocking example of different attitude towards value of life. Well, first we've got to say bye-bye, baby. Killing people for religious reasons. Human sacrifice. Again, something that is practiced pretty much universally by all ancient cultures, although to very varying degrees. Meaning some cultures did it rarely, some cultures did it every day. The Greeks and Romans weren't that big into human sacrifice. But other cultures, it was a daily occurrence. Some cultures sacrificed prisoners or slaves. You know, when the emperor of China died thousands of years ago, they would behead hundreds of prisoners at his funeral. You guys heard of Genghis Khan? Great Mongol conqueror of Asia? When he died in the 13th century, he was buried with 40 virgins and 40 horses. Some cultures consider it a great honor to offer up themselves or their own children as human sacrifice. This is, by the way, from National Geographic. An Inca girl. She was killed over 500 years ago. Look how well preserved she is. Frozen at the top of a mountain. But she's not a prisoner or a slave. Like many young children or young girls at the time, she was given by the parents, drugged, strangled, and buried at the top of the mountain as an offering to the mountain gods. But the worst example I could think of killing people for religious reasons are probably the Aztecs. Anyone been to Mexico City?
Yeah.
So modern Mexico City, the center is a dried up lake which used to have the capital of the Aztec Empire, a city called Tenochtitlan. The Aztecs went to war basically to capture people alive, to schlep them up this 150-foot high pyramid, and to rip out their hearts where they were still beating. And they did this to up to 1,000 people a week, because they believed if the blood stopped flowing, the world would cease to exist. It's human sacrifice on a scale that is absolutely mind-blowing. But the worst example I could think of the different attitude towards value of life is killing people for entertainment. Today we have blood sport like boxing. But you're not supposed to kill people in a boxing match, right? There's limits to the level of violence, you know, like MMA fighting, mixed martial arts and stuff like that. Not so in the ancient world. In the ancient world, many cultures went all the way and killed people. You know the Aztecs who we just saw? They had a version of soccer where at the end of the game, the entire winning team was sacrificed to the gods. The winning team. Definitely didn't pay to make it to the playoffs in Aztec sports. When you think of blood sport, who do we think of? What's the worst example of blood sport in the ancient world? Right, the Romans. In over 200 locations throughout the Roman Empire, the Romans built these massive circular arenas. The second largest and the most famous is this one. We call it the Colosseum. Who's seen it in real life? Who's been there in real life? You guys got to travel more. You get a free stopover back from Israel. Check it out on the way back. Here's what it looks like today, which is a mere skeleton of what it used to look like. Here is a recreation of what the building looked like 2,000 years ago. It was a massive theater where the roof could go off and on it 2,000 years ago. It could seat 50,000 people. The entire center of the arena could be mechanically lowered and filled with water so boats could sail in it. They could raise up to 1,000 people at a time through elevators in the floor and put in fake trees and rocks like a Hollywood movie set. If you don't mind, I'm going to hold up the questions if you don't mind. What was it used for? By the way, always free. Free entrance, free meat, free wine. Can you imagine that American football game with free beer? Want a scarier thought? British football game with free beer. But 50,000 men, women, and children, this was considered excellent entertainment for small kids, would come watch. The first act of the day was the Romans went around the empire bringing back thousands of exotic animals and watched them rip each other to shreds. Lions and tigers and bears, sometimes up to 1,000 animals in a morning. Animal rights people would have been nuts, but they would have been act number 2, which was feeding people to animals. But then in the afternoon, along with chariot races, the biggest sporting event in the empire, in the Colosseum, was gladiators, prisoners or slaves who fought to the death in front of thousands of screaming fans. And by the way, the Romans didn't just use men. They used women, children, blind people, dwarves, anything for the sake of entertainment. Most sophisticated civilization in the ancient world was also the most brutal, which, by the way, doesn't mean that you could go around murdering people in the streets of Rome. The Romans were totally into law and order. But guys, there's no connection between law and order and culture and values. You see that in the ancient world. What's the best example in the 20th century? Most technologically advanced and culturally advanced civilization in the Western world was Germany. And look what they did. So we see, guys, for many different reasons, the most basic of all of our rights, value of life, is absent from the ancient world. Moving along to peace. Now today, everyone wants peace. You know, like people are against the U.S. military presence in Iraq or Afghanistan. You know, they carry signs that war is not healthy for children and other living things. It's a pretty obvious point that war isn't healthy for anyone. It's the most destructive pastime in human history. How much money does the world spend on arms, defense budgets every year nowadays? Arming armies? What do you think? The collective military budget of the planet Earth is about $1.4 trillion, of which the United States spends $600 billion of that, more than the next 15 countries in the world combined. Any Canadians here? Okay, don't declare war on the U.S. Canadian Army is awesome. Like all 10 soldiers are unbelievable. Just joking. No, seriously. But $1.4 trillion. What could you do with that money if you didn't have armies to arm, wars to fight, weapons to buy? How much food, housing, education, medicine? Tens of thousands of children die every day in Africa from diseases related to not having clean water. What, we just figured it out today? War is destructive? But if we know it today and they knew it thousands of years ago, then how come 6,000 years of human history is 6,000 years of warfare? Why is there so much war in human history? Any ideas? Maybe we'll have it like Aish, Yarchei, Kallah brings peace to the world. It'll be headlines tomorrow. Well, you know what war stands for, by the way? We are right. But why do you think? Might makes right. Might makes right. That's we are right. That's war. But the most basic reason for war is greed. Taking what's not yours by force, especially land. Number 2, what's the law of the jungle? Right, the strong survive, the weaker lunch. The lion's on top of the food chain because he eats everyone and no one eats him. He doesn't say to the gazelle in Africa, you had a rough day, rest by the waterhole, I'll go catch a wildebeest today. If I catch you, your lunch. That's how animals behave. That's how empires behave. You think Rome ever respected any country's borders? If the Romans didn't conquer someone, like the Persians, only because they couldn't. Conquest was natural, not to conquer was a sign of weakness. And the third reason, who's glorified in the ancient world? Where's the world's first heroic literature in the West? It's on the screen. Remember the Iliad? Trojan horse, that stuff? Go read it again. It's one giant battle scene with occasional breaks for long speeches. Because the hero, by definition, is the warrior, the guy who kills the most and greatest opponents. He gets the honor, the glory, and the power when he's alive, and he becomes a legend after he's dead. Guys, to be a warrior is the thing for men to do throughout everywhere in human history, especially in the ancient world. And I say men specifically, because if women ran the world, it would be a completely different world. A woman comedian once said, you know, when a woman gets depressed, she eats or she shops. When a man gets depressed, he goes and invades another country. And it's glorified in all ancient literature. This is Wallace Caldwell of Columbia. He's talking about the Greeks, but it holds true for everyone. He says, war therefore is in the mind of the poet, the chief business of men from youth to age. But he regards as the special flower of youth. The glorification of war, the glamour and glory of battle were subjects of the finest words and pictures. But to be fair, guys, the Romans had a period of 200 years called Pax Romana. What's Pax in Latin? Peace, 200 years of, the Romans never had 2 years of peace. So what was the Roman idea of peace? What do you think? What do you think the Romans considered peace? Sorry? Yeah, we conquer the world and we have peace. Today we'd call that aggressive, expansionist, colonial behavior. Back then they called it peace. I personally postulate, if you could beam yourself back to the Roman Empire 2,000 years ago and say, hey guys, you know what peace is going to be in the 21st century? That big superpower countries like America aren't going to gobble up their neighbors like Canada and Mexico, which by the way, US could do in a week, no problem. They're not going to do it because it's just not cool. They would have needed Prozac when they heard that. That's how depressed they would have been. Because they lived for war. And you look at the ancient world, you see peace was basically the break that civilizations and empires took between wars to rearm and fight again. Otherwise, it's absent, so another value gone. Okay, moving along. Equal justice. Now, today we live in a world where, we're all living in democracy, so we don't appreciate this point. By the way, the true power of a democracy has less to do with whether you vote or not, and more to do with something like the United States Constitution, a system of laws that everyone is subject to and no one is above. That's the real power of a true democracy. If we go back to the ancient world, look at this guy over here, over this guy here in the blue. We'll call him Joe Average Ancient Guy. Where is Joe Average Ancient Guy on the socioeconomic ladder? Is he upper class, middle class, or lower class? Lower class. What will we call him? What title do we give him? Peasant or serf. Now we associate that with Europe, feudal Europe of 1,000 years ago, but feudal systems exist everywhere in the world. But 1,000 years ago in Europe, the average person was a peasant or a serf, like 90% of the population. What do they do for a living? The same thing he's doing, which is what? He's farming. Does he own the land he farms? Usually not. Even if he owns a little piece of land, who does he pay most of what he harvests in taxes to? Right, the Lord. And with an outfit like this man has no plans to do any manual labor. Like last time I was in Florida in South Beach, I saw a guy dressed just like that. But what gives the Lord the right to lord over the peasants? He's a teeny percentage of the population. What, they elected him to be Lord? What gave him the right to be Lord? The golden rule. What's the golden rule? Right, he who has the gold makes the rules. Birth and wealth are the sole criteria for leadership in the ancient world, what you and your family owned. And between that teeny nobility and everyone else, is there equality before the law, guys? There's institutionalized inequality, with the nobility being above the law and everyone else having no rights and being at their mercy. And of course, the greatest difference is you look at monarchs in the ancient world. A guy like Pharaoh 4,500 years ago was a living god. You have no idea how powerful he is. By the time you get to the guy in the middle, who's that guy?
Henry VIII.
Yeah, the great Renaissance kings of Europe, Henry VIII, 500 years ago. They're no longer living gods, but they rule by divine right. Remember divine right of kings from like a European world history class? What's divine right of kings?
God chose them.
God made me king, and if you don't like it, what did the Queen of Hearts say in Alice in Wonderland? Off with his head. And he did it to 2 of his own wives. He had 6. He beheaded 2 of them. Anyone know the 2 wives he beheaded? Trivia? Sorry? Anne, which Anne? He had a couple of Annes. Everyone gets Anne Boleyn. No one gets the other one. The other one is called Catherine Howard. Okay, but to be fair, guys, where is the world's first democracy? Where does it begin? Anyone know? Where's the word from? Greece, Demos Kratos, Athens, 2,500 years ago, and they had a much more efficient democratic system. Guys, today in America, do you vote for anything directly? No, you vote for a congressman or woman who maybe shows up and votes the way you elected him or her to vote. In Greek democracy, all citizens vote directly on every single issue. Wouldn't that be great? But who were citizens who could vote in Greece? Sorry? Exactly. Men with land. Adult men with land. It's an oligarchy. Everyone else, women, children, no one else had any rights. No one else had the right to vote, for sure not. Freedmen, slaves, aliens, they were all disenfranchised. If you could go back to ancient Greece thousands of years ago and say, hey guys, you know what equal justice is going to be in the 21st century? That everyone, man, woman, rich, poor, all treated equally before the same set of laws, they would have laughed in your face and told you that you're out of your mind. Henry Phelps Brown of Oxford explains, he says, the Greeks distinguished strongly between different types of persons and thought it only proper to treat them differently. This inequality of treatment they endorsed in the name of justice, an endorsement that with Aristotle included the justification for slavery. Only those men were citizens who had certain qualifications. Beyond them it was taken for granted. Were all women, but also farmers, laborers, mechanics, freedmen, slaves, and aliens. So another value, gone. Moving along to education. Now we take this for granted because we all come from countries where you get free public school. And then in America, it becomes insanely expensive to go to university. Like, I went to Vassar. It's now $67,000 a year, tuition, room, and board. Forget it. Anyway, but we assume in any modern, liberal, democratic country today, government not only has an obligation to educate us to a certain minimum level, but government actually wants to do that. By the way, what do you gain by educating your population? I once asked that, and a girl yells out, "An educated population." It's like a great answer. What do you gain by educating your population? Seriously.
Discoveries.
You get a first world country. One of the big defining factors between the first and third world is the average level of literacy and education of the population. So come on, the Greeks, they loved wisdom. Socrates, Plato. The Romans, look at how organized their armies were. They must have had like a great public school system. That's what we might think. But go back to Joe Average, ancient guy over there with his torn stocking. You can even see in the picture. What percentage of people in the ancient world do you think historians estimate were functionally literate? I'm not talking about college grads, like basic rates of literacy, like elementary school level.
1%.
1% is a good guess, but it's like 10 times too high. It's about 1/10 of 1%. Now this, again, it varied from place to place and time to time, but on average, in the ancient world, until the printing press and the Protestant Reformation 500 years ago, 1 in 1,000 people could read. That is mind-blowing. Why are the rates of literacy so crazy low? Why do you think? Was it important? Sorry?
Can't rebel against the government.
Everyone always jumps on they can't rebel, but what's the more basic reason?
There wasn't that much.
Writing, there was writing. Sorry?
There wasn't that many versions of each book to read.
The printing press helped too, but the number one reason, by the way, think about it. If you come from a first world country, and all of you guys come from first world countries, and you live in a nice house, not a shack, a shed, a hut, house, running water, indoor plumbing, electricity, kitchen full of food that you don't eat all of it because you're worried about being fat. You guys have any idea what a luxury it is in human history, and even in the world today, to worry about overeating? And you got like a 9-to-5 job, you got vacations, health plan, retirement benefits, you got your teeth in your mouth past the age of 25 and you live to see your own grandchildren? Guys, you have a standard of living that not only exceeds virtually everyone who lived in the ancient world, you have a standard of living exceeding most people living in the world today. What was the daily goal of the average ancient peasant going back thousands of years ago? Just to survive. Before modern science and technology and medicine, you had horrendous rates of disease, plagues, wars, famine. Even giving birth was dangerous. Up until 200 years ago in industrialized England, half the children died by the age of 2. And if the name of the game is survive, what do your kids have to do as soon as they're old enough to start doing it? They got to work, which is why child labor is a universal phenomenon in the ancient world and in the third world today. Send my kid to school, we starve. But let's say you're a little better off and could afford to send your kid to school and even pay some tuition if you had to. You think you'd find a school system even for pay in the ancient world? Very rare indeed. The Greeks who loved wisdom considered it a form of prostitution for a teacher to sell his wisdom. No, he taught a select group of young students. And of course, the other reason why there's so little literacy in the ancient world, think about it, Occupy Wall Street. Who starts all these movements? That girl. I think single-handedly could be doing it all. She looks very belligerent. Students. Why students? Because they have a unique combination. They're young and idealistic, and they're educated and empowered. And you put those two things together, and you have a very difficult group of people to control. And in the non-democratic ancient world, they figured out pretty fast the best way to keep things stable was to keep people stupid. William Harris of Harvard explains, the written culture of antiquity is in the main restricted to a privileged minority. It should be obvious that in Greece, and to an even greater extent in the Roman Empire, the illiteracy of the masses contributed to the stability of political order. The disturbances caused by the spread of literacy, on the other hand, have been numerous and varied. The Greeks and Romans would have become very different people if, per impossible, they'd achieved mass literacy. So whether because of just having to survive or deliberate government policy, and usually it's a combination of both, virtually no one in the ancient world could read, so another value gone.
Was it so necessary to
Hold on,
back then?
Okay, moving along. That's my graphic artist's graduation photograph. There's his cameo appearance in his presentation. Now you saw him. Okay, moving along to family. Now, family, we said, is not a value, but an institution essential for all values. If family collapses, society falls apart. Every culture has a family structure. We're not going to look directly at that. We're going to look at a subcategory, which is something that we can't ignore, but something they never talk about in school, which is the impact of sexuality and modesty, not just on family stability, but the stability of whole civilizations and empires. Now, to appreciate this point, it depends on how old you are. talking to Americans now. I'm not saying some of you aren't old enough to understand. The standards in America have changed dramatically. I remember they used to have commercials where they actually showed you the product. Now, sometimes the product barely appears and you're focusing on something else. Because we are so desensitized, and believe me, I edited this ad very significantly. Because we're focusing on other stuff, because that's what sells, that's what gets our attention. You can't get people to blush anymore. Guys, compared to the ancient world, we are living in a G-rated Walt Disney film in the 21st century. I personally postulate if the Greeks and Romans had TV advertising and internet like we have today, their civilizations would have collapsed much faster than they did because they were just so much more open than any of the societies that we have in the world today. A couple of examples to illustrate. This is some Greek and Roman art. I could have used Chinese, Japanese, or Indian art. A couple things about our images. Number one is for modesty reasons. We have not put any women in there. Number two is for modesty reasons. We have removed something from all the men. But you got to appreciate that in the ancient world of Greece and Rome, they not only had no problem with full frontal nudity, but with the most graphic pornographic images on the walls of your living room and on your dinnerware. When you got to the bottom of your cornflakes bowl in ancient Greece, you did not find Winnie the Pooh. You saw something much more interesting, and you noticed that there's a huge amount of nudity, and everyone looks great. You never saw a fat Greek statue. They're all ripped. Like, why? Take the discus thrower here, this guy. Where do the Olympics begin, by the way? We're having it next week. The Winter Olympics did not begin there, but where did the original Olympics begin? Not in Korea.
Athens.
In Greece. There were pseudo-military sporting events where young men ran, wrestled, threw spears, discuses. It was all done in the nude. Good thing they had no advertising back then because there was no place for the Nike signs, no tracksuits. And it wasn't because they couldn't afford sportswear, because they didn't want to wear it. Because in ancient Greece, the human form was considered the ultimate expression of beauty and perfection, and you wanted to show it all off to everyone. The standards of modesty are so dramatically different. Where did the Greeks practice, by the way, their sports? The same building that you do today, a building called a gymnasium, which comes from the Greek word gymnos, which means naked. And all of you are going to remember that next time you go to a gym, I promise you. But guys, the standards are so different. What's the most open country in Europe today? No, it's actually the Netherlands. Amsterdam especially, where pot has been legal way before Denver and Washington State, and prostitution is a completely legal profession that is unionized and has health benefits. But even in Amsterdam, if you need to go to a public restroom, you go into a men's room or a woman's room and into a stall. You know what a public toilet was in ancient Greece? It was a public toilet. Like a bench on the street. Imagine you're cruising on the light rail tonight up Jaffa Road, and there's benches on the side of the street for that same purpose. Dramatically different. In the area of sexuality, the contrast is even more extreme. When I was a little kid growing up, you never even said that word. You never showed anything. Anyone remember the Brady Bunch? That was that's such a hokey 1970s show. That was the first TV show where a married couple wearing pajamas was in the same bed together reading a newspaper, and that was considered like risque. Same bed, oh my God. Today, forget it. You never talk about alternative lifestyles, LGBT, whatever. Today, we talk and accept everything. The catchphrase is what consenting adults want to do behind closed doors is their business. We think we're so open today, the Western world, compared to the ancient world. We are absolute Puritans in terms of the conservatism of the world. In the ancient world, by the way, there's no idea of coming out of the closet. Not because they didn't have closets for the tracksuits they didn't wear. But there's no idea of right or wrong in a physical relationship with another human being. With slight variations, by the way, there's one huge double standard between two groups of people I discovered when researching this topic. Which two groups of people had the big, was distinguishing, they made a big distinguishing. Men and women. Meaning men and women are always controlled by societies everywhere in human history, whether they're allowed to do. But as a guy in the ancient world, it was considered pretty much equally normal and acceptable to have a physical relationship with another man, a boy, a woman, a girl, a sheep, a goat, an inanimate object. Sexuality permeated the world in ways that would make the most open society today blush. Now, even in a place like in Amsterdam today, where consenting adults can do whatever they like, they'll still say, you know, guys, whatever you want to do is fine, but please, no children involved in this. The pedophile thing, unfortunately, we hear about, not so in the ancient world. In a place like ancient Greece, a physical and an educational relationship between a well-educated upper-class Greek male and a young boy, pre-adolescent, was considered A, the highest form of love, and B, a vital part of a child's education. You guys know Plato, the Greek philosopher? Okay, look, this is his symposium. Here's one of the characters in Plato's symposium talking about a relationship between a man and a boy. He says, I, for my part, am at a loss to say what a greater blessing A man can have in his earliest youth an honorable lover. If we could somehow contrive to have a city or an army composed of lovers and their favorites, they could not be better citizens of their country. No man is such a craven that love's own influence cannot inspire him with valor that makes him equal to the bravest born. He says it toughens you, which is not the image, the stereotype image of a gay guy today, but back then. But question is, this is, what's interesting is today the stereotype is sometimes gay guys are effeminate, not so in the ancient world. Many societies, whether it's Greek warrior culture of Sparta or Japanese samurai culture, real men chased boys, wimps wasted their time on women. Now I know this is not something you heard about when you studied ancient Greek culture in the 6th grade, but this is the reality of the culture. The question is, what's the impact? How did this impact birth rates or treatment of women? What did the Greeks think of women? Look at the Greek poet Plato. Marriage brings a man only 2 happy days. The day he takes his bride to bed and the day he lays her in her grave. Not one of the early feminist writers. Look at the Greek poet Propertius. May all my enemies fall in love with women and all my friends with boys. And you look at ancient Greece, it's a shocking contrast. On one hand, one of the most progressive, open, free-thinking societies. On the other hand, one of the most misogynist, women-hating cultures of all time. By the way, the Romans always made fun of the Greeks for being totally out of control. The Romans ended up being worse. The royal families of Rome were so dysfunctional, it's amazing that the empire survived as long as it did. But think about it. How did this impact birth rates in these places? If men are busy chasing everything, but they collapsed. Greek men were way too busy chasing anything but their wives to make any babies. Rome already during the reign of Augustus Caesar tried to pass laws to force men to marry and have a minimum number of children. You can't force people to have kids. It's got to be a value in society. Rome built the greatest empire in the Western world because Roman citizens fought and died in the Roman legions. When the Roman Empire collapsed in the 4th century, the 5th century, they literally had no one left to fight in their army. They had to outsource their security needs to Germanic nomadic mercenaries. You can't defend an empire with mercenaries. Some of the greatest civilizations literally rotted from within before they were overrun from without. And to a very significant extent, it had to do with the collapse of family, so another value gone. And last but not least, guys, we got social responsibility. And this one is really quick and easy to do because simply put, there wasn't any in the ancient world. Today, in all modern Western liberal democratic countries, there is social welfare infrastructure. If you're hungry, if you're homeless, government's going to help you, right? You guys know that almost all the social welfare that exists in the Western world today came into existence in around the last 200 years or so. 2,000 years ago in Rome, which was probably the biggest city on the planet Earth, if you were hungry and homeless and didn't have family to help, tough die. The government would do absolutely nothing for you. And today we have this idea of international social responsibility. If there's like a tsunami or an earthquake, every country sends in relief workers and you have International Monetary Fund, United Nations peacekeeping forces. You think you had any of that in the ancient world? Can you imagine asking Rome for a peacekeeping force? That's a very scary thought. What were leaders in the non-democratic world interested in? It was one word, it began with the letter P, and it was not the word peace. What do you think? Power. Exactly. Preserving it, passing it on, increasing it. Remember Genghis Khan, the guy who was buried with the 40 virgins and the 40 horses? Look what he says is meaningful in this world. The greatest happiness is to vanquish your enemies, to chase them before you, to rob them of their wealth, to see those dear to them bathed in tears, to clasp to your bosom their wives and daughters. A true humanitarian visionary. This value, totally absent. So what are we left with, guys? A very different vision of the ancient world than we got in our 7th grade world history overview. But no one should misunderstand me. I'm not saying that everyone in the ancient world was evil and horrible. It's not true. The vast, vast, vast majority of people in the ancient world are just trying to do what? Survive. They're not hurting anyone. And I'm not saying that good ideas and technology didn't come out of the ancient world, because they certainly did. We all benefit from that today. But what I am saying is true is that this beautiful vision of values that the whole world today wants is not a byproduct of the thinking or the culture of these great civilizations like Greece or Rome or any of these other people. So we're left with this huge question: where do we get the values from? There's a British historian by the name of Paul Johnson. And he wrote a book in 1987 called The History of the Jews, which I was recommending actually for years until, of course, I wrote a better one. Ask my mother, she'll tell you. Crash Course in Jewish History. But anyway, Paul Johnson's book is especially interesting because he's not even Jewish. But what he says in his epilogue is a fascinating quote. He does such a great job of answering this question, I want to share it with you. He says, one way of summing up 4,000 years of Jewish history is to ask ourselves, what would have happened to the human race if Abraham had not been a man of great sagacity? Great SAT word. It means sage-like, wise, or clever. Or if he had stayed in Ur and kept his higher notions to himself, and no specific Jewish people would have come into being. Certainly the world without the Jews would have been a radically different place. Humanity might eventually have stumbled upon all the Jewish insights, but we cannot be sure. All the great conceptual discoveries of the human intellect seem obvious and inescapable once they have been revealed, but it requires a special genius to formulate them for the first time. The Jews had this gift. Pay special attention to what he says now, keeping in mind the list I got from my audience to create the presentation. Whoop. Sorry, where are we? Doop, doop. To them, meaning the Jews, we owe the idea of equality before the law, both divine and human, of the sanctity of life and the dignity of human person, of individual conscience and so of personal redemption, of collective conscience and so of social responsibility, of peace as an abstract ideal and love as the foundation of justice, and many other items which constitute the basic moral furniture of the human mind. Without the Jews, it might have been a much emptier place. Above all, the Jews taught us how to rationalize the unknown. The result was monotheism and the three great religions which profess it. It is almost beyond our capacity to imagine how the world would have fared if they had never emerged. I always say it's a good thing a non-Jew said this, because if a Jewish guy said it, we'd never believe it. And what Paul Johnson is saying is not unique to Paul Johnson. In the course of researching my book, I came across dozens of presidents, prime ministers, philosophers, historians, thinkers. They all say the Jewish people civilized the world. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying Jews are perfect and, there's rotten Jews running around, even before Harvey Weinstein, there's no question. We didn't invent every nice idea in the world, not true either, but there's no question that we, the teeny tiny Jewish people who shouldn't even be here, have had a far bigger impact on the collective conscience of humanity. As to why that is so, we'll see in just a minute. But what I want to do very briefly, much more briefly than I did the first part, guys, is I want to run you back through our list and show you how in every single one of these areas, Judaism is truly transformative and revolutionary. So beginning with value of life. The clearest distinction between the Jewish concept of value of life and everyone else's can be best seen by looking at number 6 of the 10 Commandments. What's number 6? Right, don't murder. Always mistranslated as thou shalt not kill, the most mistranslated word in the Bible. It's lo tirtzach. But Judaism taught the world human life has intrinsic value. Like, you don't kill babies. God doesn't need human blood. God forbid you kill a human being for entertainment. Why, by the way, is it lo tirtzach, don't murder, and not lo taharog, don't kill? Sorry? No, I'm not ready to meet, but... Sorry? Because there are situations, there's a death penalty in Jewish law. Sometimes you have to destroy evil to preserve good in this world. By the way, because we value life so much, you're supposed to violate almost all the laws of the Torah to save a human being's life. The situations you're allowed to go to war in. Who's seen Schindler's List? Remember the scene at the end of Oscar Schindler, a German industrialist, the only, by the way, Nazi party member to become recognized as righteous amongst the nations at Yad Vashem. But Oscar Schindler is given a ring at the end of the movie, and the story on it is this inscription. He who saves one life as if he saves an entire universe. The infinite value of every human life. Guys, keep in mind the rabbis are saying this at the same time as the Romans are killing thousands of people for entertainment. It's revolutionary. Peace. Okay, what's the word for peace in Hebrew, guys? Shalom. What's the word for hello in Hebrew? Shalom. So basic is peace to our worldview. It's how you greet your fellow human being. The word shalom appears 240 times in the Hebrew Bible. The rabbis obsess on it. But the best proof of the Jewish obsession with peace doesn't come from Jewish sources. What is the world body today supposedly dedicated to bringing peace to the world when it's not obsessively condemning Israel? Right, the UN, the useless nations. In theory, a great idea. In practice, not so good. But if you go outside UN headquarters in New York, Dag Hammarskjöld Plaza, you'll see by the outside of the building is this wall with this inscription on it. From the quote from Isaiah the prophet about beating swords into plowshares and spears into pruning hooks. This is the motto of the UN. Why is this quote of all quotes about peace the motto of the UN? Because the founders of the League of Nations that became the United Nations knew that the people who first brought the idea of peace as the ideal permanent state for the human race are the Jewish people. Moving along to equal justice. What's the word for justice in Hebrew, by the way? Tzedek. What's the word for charity in Hebrew? Tzedakah. The root of the word charity is the word justice. That word, by the way, appears 120 times in the Bible, tzedek. It's interesting. Shalom 240, tzedek 120, exactly half. Maybe it's a connection. Maybe you need twice as much justice to get a little peace. I have no idea. But out of the obsession with this word comes a concept that has transformed the idea of equality before the law. In Leviticus 19:15 it says, you shall do no unrighteousness in judgment. You shall not respect the person of the poor nor honor the person of the mighty. But in righteousness you shall judge your neighbor, which in simple English means what? No favoritism either way. Today it's like, duh. Trust me, guys, in the ancient world, this was not an obvious point. We don't appreciate this point because we don't have these all-powerful monarchies where the king is above the law and a living God. Come on, today you think of a reigning monarch. Who do you think of today? A monarch reigning in the world today. Everyone thinks of, sorry, Donald Trump, exactly.
Queen Elizabeth.
Queen Elizabeth II. You're British, right? See, at least you got it. Thank God. Okay, here's a woman who has no political power. She pays taxes and gets no nachas from her kids. This is not a monarchy. Compared to the ancient world, these guys, but compare these guys to a Jewish king. You know, every Jew's supposed to write a Torah scroll. You know, it's a mitzvah. Most of us don't do it, but okay. A Jewish king has to write a second scroll and wear it, a mini scroll attached to his arm. Why does he do that? It says exactly why in the book of Deuteronomy. So he will learn to fear the Lord his God, to keep all the words of his Torah and do its statutes. The king has to know he's a king of kings, and no one, not even the king, is above the law. This, by the way, is the first example of limiting the power of a monarch in human history. And you guys should appreciate that the biblical government of Israel was not a pure monarchy, nor was it a theocracy where like the mullahs in Iran ran the show. It was a division of powers, mixed system, checks, balances. Chief political leader in ancient Israel was whom? The king. But the chief religious leader was whom? Who's the chief religious leader in biblical Israel? The Kohen Gadol, the high priest. But the judicial legislative power rested in which body? The Sanhedrin, 71 judges. These guys were like the Congress, the Senate, and the Supreme Court all rolled into one. They had a lot of power. Anywhere else in the world to have that power, it was the golden rule. What did you have to sit on the Sanhedrin? Anyone know? First, we had to be married with kids. Exactly. Why? Mercy, exactly. The Sanhedrin can pass a death sentence. Every human being is someone's child. Being a parent teaches you mercy. The fact, come on, that we let our, if you're a teenager and your parents let you survive, oh my God, definitely a sign they learn mercy. You know, Roseanne Barr once said, now that I have teenagers, I realize why some mammals eat their young. What else did you have to have? Encyclopedic knowledge of everything. No smartphone that knows everything and we know nothing. You have to have it all in your brain. And another great qualification, like unquestioning integrity. Come on, guys, political integrity today, that's a total oxymoron. What's an oxymoron? Two words that don't go together, like pretty ugly. Jumbo shrimp. As the British would say, American culture. And then the Americans shoot back, British cooking. Yeah, French military victories, those kind of words never go together. Seriously. It's a unique system, meritocracy. The best person for the job got the job regardless of their position in society. Moving along, education. We could skip this because every Jewish parent thinks there's actually 11 big commandments. What's number 11? Thou shalt go to college. And the rabbis say, preferably Ivy League with full scholarship up through PhD. That's called Chidur Mitzvah, glorifying the commandments. Remember that joke about the theological debate? When is a fetus viable? When can it live outside the mother's womb? And the Jewish mother answers, when it graduates from medical or law school. Jews are educationally obsessed people, and we have a unique status in human history. Jews are history's only consistently highly literate nation. We're not the only people to like wisdom. We're the only people to actually educate our populations. Chinese love wisdom. The Greeks love wisdom, but their rates of literacy amongst the masses were infinitesimally small. Meanwhile, the Jewish rates were always statistically off the charts compared to the rest of the world, and it came out of the fundamentally different way that Jews looked at education. Everyone's saying keep people ignorant to control them. Judaism saying, you must educate people to empower them to take responsibility. Does everyone here know Maimonides, the Rambam? Great medieval Jewish scholar. Okay, when he summarized all of Jewish law in his Mishnah Torah, look what he says about education. Appoint teachers for the children in every country, province, and city. In any city that does not have a school, excommunicate the people of the city until they get teachers for the children. If they don't, destroy the city because the world exists only because of the breadth of children studying. Destroy the city? Never happened, because we always had schools. And if you're thinking, yeah, Maimonides, Rabbi, you can't believe what he says, he's biased. Look what Peter Abelard, medieval French Catholic thinker and theologian, says about the Jews. He says, a Jew, whoever poor, if he had 10 sons, would put them all to letters. Not for gain as the Christians do, but for understanding of God's law. And not only his sons, but his daughters. Moving along, family. Now, family for us is huge. You know why? it's the excuse to get together and eat, which is the major Jewish cultural pastime. You guys must have heard that joke. A summary of all Jewish holidays. They tried to kill us. We won. Let's eat. But going back to the first male-female relationship in the Bible, Adam and Eve, you see a revolution at the beginning. It says a man shall leave his mother and father and cleave to his wife, and they'll become one flesh. The Torah is not talking about giving your wife a hug, as sweet as that is. It's bringing down a very profound Kabbalistic metaphysical idea that's called zivug. That a man and a woman are two halves of the same soul. They come together, and you are not complete until you're married. And that the sexual and emotional energy of a man is supposed to be exclusively directed into a legally binding relationship with a woman called marriage, and should not be directed anywhere else. And by the way, it's not just about controlling and directing. It's about loving and respecting your spouse, as Maimonides said so beautifully. And so our rabbis decreed that a man should honor his wife more than himself and love her as much as he loves himself. Which is pretty short but very progressive, especially when compared to our Greek friend Pallidus, remember? Marriage brings a man only 2 happy days. The day he takes his bride to bed and the day he lays her in her grave. By the way, few people appreciate how much Judaism controlling and directing sexuality has been one of the greatest stabilizing forces in human history. You guys know Dennis Prager? He's the author, radio guy. He sums it up beautifully when he says, man's nature, undisciplined by values, allows sex to dominate his life and the life of society. When Judaism demanded that all sexual activity be channeled into marriage, it changed the world. Societies that did not place boundaries around sexuality were stymied in their development. The subsequent dominance of the Western world can, to a significant extent, be attributed to the sexual revolution initiated by Judaism and later carried forward by Christianity. And last but not least, we got social responsibility. And this is the other area where Judaism is completely unique. Because Jews are also history's only socially aware, proactive people. And the rest of the world had no social responsibility. The smallest, poorest, oldest Jewish communities had social welfare infrastructure far older and far more comprehensive than the greatest empires in the ancient world. And it goes back to another radically transformative idea the Jewish people taught the world, which is in Leviticus 19:16. Lo talmod al dam re'echa. You guys heard the quote before? What does it mean? Don't stand by your neighbor's blood. Don't stand in it because you might get blood on your shoes and ruin them? No, Judaism's saying if you see a human being in distress, physical, emotional, economic, you got to help. Guys, we didn't invent law. There's a lot of Jewish lawyers, but any society that doesn't want anarchy needs a legal code. Almost all legal codes are purely prohibitive. Don't murder, don't steal, pay your taxes, stop at the red light, you're a good citizen. Judaism has prohibitions, but has a unique proactive component. You have to actively do good. Think about it. In America today, you see someone in trouble and you don't help. What's your legal status?
Better off than if you try and help and don't.
You get sued for injuring the person. Exactly. No, it's not. You're a bystander. It's not my problem. I don't want to be involved. Judaism says, You make only one of two choices. You're part of the problem or you're part of the solution. Doing nothing makes you part of the problem. You have a legal obligation to be part of the solution. By the way, it's 3,329 years since Mount Sinai, and there's virtually no legal code on the planet Earth outside of the Torah that demands you actively do good, which is most beautifully stated by Leviticus 19:18, probably the 3 most famous words from the Hebrew Bible, V'ahavta le'arecha kamocha. Love your neighbor as yourself. Like, what does that mean? I stand on a street corner with a smiley button on, handing out flowers, telling people to have a nice day? No, it means you got to give 10% of your income to charity, whether you like it or not. You have to help the widows, the orphans, the downtrodden, the oppressed. It's not just Jews, it's also non-Jews. It's not just human beings. You guys recognize the first environmental law and the first animal rights law that appears anywhere in the world appears in Jewish law. It's this whole sweeping vision of taking care of the world, which is part and parcel of Jewish communal life everywhere at all time and way before anyone else thought of it. And you guys got to appreciate that almost all the great modern social thinkers in the Western world will credit Jewish thought and the Bible as their source of inspiration. Here's a great example. American social thinker and activist Lyman Abbott from over 100 years ago. He said, it'll be impossible to mention any other people of even a much later age whose law and constitution embodied an ideal so noble as that embodied in Hebrew civil laws, or any people whose history shows the existence of political institutions so essentially just, free, and humane. We Gentiles owe our life to Israel. It is Israel who, in bringing us the divine law, has laid the foundation of liberty. It is Israel who had the first free institutions the world ever saw. When sometimes our own unchristian prejudices flame out against the Jewish people, let us remember that all that we have and all that we are, we owe under God to what Judaism has given us. That's a nice quote. So put it all together, guys, and we have this amazing fact that the Jewish people and Jewish thought have been the most powerful civilizing force in history. But we're left with one final question that we have to answer before we finish. What is it about us that enabled us so small to have such a big impact? So to understand that, we have to look at one more idea, but it's the idea from which we get all of this and without which we have none of it. So besides obvious great Jewish contributions to the world like guilt, bagels, junk bonds, leverage buyouts, Einstein, Marx, Freud, 23% of all the Nobel Prizes since 1900, and all that other great trivia, what is the greatest Jewish contribution to civilization? Exactly. One God, brought to you by the Jewish people. One God and one absolute standard of morality. Call it ethical monotheism, whatever you like. There's no question in the realm of morality and spirituality. It is the most transformative idea in human history. It's an idea today which we can look back in time and see has transformed the world, but it's an idea which thousands of years ago was completely incomprehensible to everyone. If you jump back 4,000 years ago, Joe Average, ancient guy in the middle here, contemplating his moral spiritual universe. Guys, in the ancient world, everyone was religious, but all religions are polytheistic. What's polytheism? Multiple gods. You perceived that every god wanted something different from you. Sure, you had standards of what was acceptable and right and wrong, but what were they based on? What you perceived the gods wanted, what was expedient. You had an ancient world that was essentially amoral. What's amorality? Because it was without morality, because it was amoral, it disintegrated into being immoral. Dostoevsky, the great Russian writer, said it the best. Where there is no God, everything is permissible. Into that world, almost 4,000 years ago, comes one man, Abraham, from Ur. Where's Ur today? Yeah, Iraq. We're all Iraqis. We all know where Iraq is. Like Ambrose Bierce, who wrote during the American Civil War, he said it the best. He said, war is God's way of teaching Americans geography. So now we all know where Iraq is. Out of Iraq, almost 4,000 years ago, comes one man who's great for two reasons. A, in a world that has totally lost connection with one God, Abraham is a radically transformative free thinker. He's able to reconnect to that idea. But imagine being the only person in the world to believe in a radically transformative and unacceptable idea. How many of us would have the chutzpah to whisper to our best friends? What does chutzpah mean? The gumption, nerve, audacity. But that's the greatest of Abraham. He says, I want truth regardless of consequences. I choose to live it if necessary, to die for the reality of God. By the way, Abraham knew really well, you don't live for God, you don't die for God, you don't do anything for God. But without relationship with God, we're doomed, we're going to eat each other alive. That's what Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad is. That's our mantra, our Jewish battle cry. God is it, the source of morality and spirituality. And look at how transformative the idea is. It says in the beginning of the Bible, we're created in His image, but Tselem Elokim, but He has no parts. So what do we have that is God-like? Every human being. Sorry? A soul. How do you say it in Hebrew? A neshama, a divine spark, so to speak, a piece of the infinite within all of us. Look at the impact of that idea. If every human being has this soul, then every human life has infinite value, which is why saving a life is like saving a universe. If every human being has a soul, there's a fundamental equality amongst all of us. This is why the prophets say, has not one God made us all? Are we not all His children? And if you're made in God's image, you have an obligation to act like Him. Which is why one of the 613 commandments is v'halachta bidrachav. Be like God, go in His ways. Just as He is kind and merciful, you have to do the same thing. We don't appreciate how transformative this all is. One more person I want to show you who does. Second President of the United States, one of the founding fathers, John Adams. What does he say? I will insist the Hebrews have done more to civilize men than any other nation. If I were an atheist and believed in blind eternal fate, I should still believe that fate had ordained the Jews to be the most essential instrument for civilizing the nations. If I were an atheist of another sect, I should still believe that chance had ordered the Jews to preserve and propagate for all mankind the doctrine of a supreme, intelligent, wise, almighty sovereign of the universe, which I believe to be the great essential principle of all morality and consequently of all civilization. They are the most glorious nation that ever inhabited this earth. The Romans and the empire brought a bubble in comparison to the Jews. They have given religion to 3/4 of the globe and have influenced the affairs of mankind more and more happily than any other nation, ancient or modern. And if he were running for president today, I would definitely be voting for him. Which brings us to the role of the Jewish people in history, guys. It's not about conquering. It's not about converting. There's never been any Jewish empire in history except for Hollywood. Complete creation of Jews and not a source of Jewish values. Our job is to be a light, to live and act in a way that inspires other people to want to follow us. Which brings us to the most misunderstood idea that every Jew needs to be able to explain. Chosen people idea. How do you explain it simply? Abraham says to God, I choose you. I choose to dedicate my life and the life of my children to one mission, to teaching the world about the reality of you, God, and the values that come from relationship with you. And God says back to Abraham, you're choosing me, Abraham, I choose you back, you and your descendants, us, the Jewish people. Guys, what are we chosen for? What are we chosen for? It's not privilege. It might be a privilege to be Jewish, but we're chosen for responsibility. What's the responsibility? The word we love to use is tikkun olam, which translates to Fix the world. How's that for a cause? A little bigger than save the whales? Which brings me to the last little teeny part of the riddle, and then we're done literally in 2 minutes. We understand the Jewish people's values have transformed the world. We understand it all comes from the idea of one God. But what's the historical process? I mean, think about it, guys. How is it the teeny tiny Jewish people, the most hated, reviled people on the planet Earth, managed to get the entire world to buy into our worldview? This is arguably the greatest subliminal marketing victory in all of human history. You guys got to appreciate it was not easy. From the birth of Abraham to the birth of Christianity, for 2,000 years, we exist alone in the world as the only people believing in one God, and the whole world hates us and is trying to kill us for it. And after being told we're crazy for 2,000 years comes the greatest spiritual, moral transformation in human history, where billions of people who used to be a bunch of amoral polytheists are basically converted to a worldview that essentially comes from us. Who are we talking about? Christians and Muslims. Exactly. Because every believing Christian and Muslim will tell you there's one God. Okay, the Christian one's got a few parts. Forget that. He created the world. He gave the Torah at Mount Sinai. He gave the Jewish people, he gave one standard of values to the human race, and then he changed his mind and chose us instead. That's a different problem and a separate presentation. But guys, that is the greatest transformation in all of human history. And what's the other way that Jewish values have gotten out to the world and gotten to places that might not be Christian or Muslim? It's not through a religious ideology, it's through a political ideology. What has been the fastest growing form of government in the last 200 plus years, guys? Modern democracy, not to be confused with the ancient democracy of the Greeks. If you study the history of the evolution of modern democracy, you'll see overwhelmingly it was created by people who firmly believe that God is the source of rights and responsibilities. It's right there in the Declaration of Independence of the United States. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that amongst these are life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. So guys, to put it all together and come to a close, if we make a graph of religions of the world, and we're more than a religion, we're also a people, but no matter what you call us, we are so small, magnifying glass, boom, there we are. We don't even appear on the graph. But if you make a graph of impact on the world, we are right off the top of the charts. Smallest of nations, biggest of impact. Guys, why did I create this presentation? So many Jews, especially younger generation of Jews, are walking around thinking that Judaism is meaningless and irrelevant. Nothing could be further from the truth. We got to have some Jewish pride. But pride's like a dangerous word. It doesn't mean walking around thinking I'm better than you and I'm superior to you. Pride is justifiable self-respect at the historically proven power of Jewish people and Jewish ideas to transform the world, because it's a fact of history, guys, that the entire human race is in a completely different place because of us. But as much as the world has bought into this vision and definitely wants it, we haven't quite gotten there yet. We can't quite retire. We've got a little more work to do. So just to close with a little bit of food for thought about what each and every one of us as part of this very special nation with a very unique responsibility should be doing to make this vision a reality. So quickly, Judaism says every human being like a snowflake is unique. There's something only you can do that no one else can do. Our job in this world is never to compare ourselves to anyone else, because there is no one like us. It's to bring out our own unique potential. But how do you do that? Complicated equipment like a phone or a computer comes with an instruction manual. Guys, we are much more complicated than a phone. And we come with an instruction manual. It's called Torah. The literal translation of Torah is instructions. Torat Chaim, the guidebook for living. Because you can't represent the Jewish people till you know what the Jewish people represents. Believe me, ignorance and not anti-Semitism is the biggest threat to us. And when we become educated, guys, we will figure out pretty fast that our job in this world is to be a light. You guys know that Jews volunteer for causes more than any other people on the planet Earth? I always say Jews for every ism except Judaism. And while I have nothing against most causes, what's a cause really? It's putting a Band-Aid on a symptom of a deeper problem. Guys, if we really want to make the world a different and better place, we have to change humanity's values. That's what the job of the Jewish people is about. And that job is not just for a couple of rabbis and a few outreach organizations. It's the collective responsibility of all the Jewish people. We have to have some Jewish unity. Like a little Israeli folk song goes, each of us is one small light, but together we shine bright. Guys, every one of us has an obligation to be proud Jews, to be proactive Jews, and to work on Jewish unity. This is the craziest thing in the Jewish world. There are millions of people who want us dead, and we are fighting amongst ourselves. I'm only going to make one prediction. I always say I'm not a prophet. If I was, I'd be working in the stock exchange. But the world is not going to leave Israel or the Jewish people alone until we finish this job. And I know it sounds like an impossible task, but trust me, guys. If you look at Jewish history, we never should have come into existence. We should not be here today. Every aspect of our history is impossible. We are living proof of the supernatural. And the guy who summed it up the best is not some rabbi. I think it's the first prime minister of Israel. Who's the first prime minister of Israel? David Ben-Gurion, he says, a Jew who doesn't believe in miracles is not a realist. A great quote for a man having a very bad hair day. But guys, when we come together as one people, unified, proud, and focusing the incredible drive and energy in what is our national historic mission, we will finally be able to give the world the vision they have been waiting for thousands of years, which is beautifully summed up by the prophet Isaiah when he says, the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established on top of the mountains, and it shall be exalted above the hills, and all the nations shall flow unto it. And many people shall go and say, come, and let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob. And he will teach us of his ways, and will walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth the Torah, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. And they shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. And thank you very much.